Okay, in this video, we're going to be talking about Chapter 8, and we'll be talking about some of the different types of application systems that we see, enterprise application systems that organizations have deployed. So a definition of an enterprise system, it's a, um, it's a software system that is really designed to provide all the function, have the capability to enable all of the different types of business processes that an organization runs as part of its business. Um, so the idea, what you'll see is, ERP systems, SCM systems, CRM systems will handle things like, for example, the order to cash process, which is the process organizations do to take sales orders and deliver products and receive payment, or hire to retire, which would be the full life cycle of an employee through initial recruitment, through hiring, through onboarding, through their life cycle, through to their retirement. Um, so the idea is that these systems are focused on end to end, providing all of the different types of business processes that organizations would need, and to do it in an integrated fashion. All right. So the function, as we say here, what it's designed to do is glue employees, customers, suppliers, partners, provide all the functions that enable you to run those types of processes. All right. So ERP, so our first type of system, class of system, is something we call an ERP system, which stands for Enterprise Resource Planning. So what it will do, it will integrate all of the different departments and operations, functions of an organization, and provide really for the effective planning, control, and execution across the entire organization. Whereas in your traditional systems, your traditional application systems are focused on one particular function, like accounting or sales orders. The ERP system incorporates all of those under one system, integrates all of those pieces together, so you see it as one as a whole. So a supply chain system, or supply chain management system, or SCM as it's called, it supports information flows between a customer or between an organization and the suppliers. All right. So the idea of every organization will have key providers of either resources or services that's used as part of its business operations. And supply chain management is targeted at aligning, the activities of uh, the suppliers with the organization's own internal operations. So the idea is you want to ensure that you have proper material delivery, appropriate pricing, just in time. So the objective is, and particularly in manufacturing, you want to minimize the amount of holding inventory, um, and perform as much as you can in a just-in-time basis. And the idea of a supply chain system is that it really has the capabilities. What its capabilities provides the ability to align both the organization and all of its suppliers. So it's as we just say it here, it supports an intricate network of business partners, because you think of how many different types of suppliers a company might have, in coordinating all of those activities. And then the third major type of enterprise system is something called CRM, or Customer Relationship Management System. So this is actually the opposite end of the value chain from the supply chain. So where supply chain coordinates activities with those business partners and those operations that are providing materials for the organization, CRM is focused on on the back end of the process, basically the sales and relationship with customers. So the idea is to understand customer activities, levels of engagement, things that are important to understand, and with the objective of really trying to improve both the loyalty, the relationship, as the title would indicate, and trying to develop a sustainable, relationship, both with intention, the idea of having retaining customers, and also trying to optimize profitability. So, the whole idea of these enterprise systems, the central focus of these things are it's really uh, provides the repository for all of the, basically all of the processes and all of the data into one central repository. So there is one system and one data model that runs everything in the organization, and all the processes are basically interacting with one common set of data, as opposed to in traditional systems, kind of the older model, where you would have data would be in different disparate systems and non-aligned or not connected and not coordinated. So we talked a bit about value chain and the relationships of Porter's value chain model. But as you look at what the idea of a ERP system, an SCS system, a CRM system, if we think of it in terms of a value chain, what a ERP system does is a system that it really is focused on the implementing and operating the organization's value chain, internally, as we talk around this end to end, from inbound, the value add processes from inbound logistics out through outbound, through delivery, through ongoing service, and in addition, all the supporting activities, as we see, the procurement, human resources, technology, things of that nature, infrastructure. All right, so an ERP system is focused on the organization's, the company's value chain, whereas an SCM system is focused on the relationship of that organization's value chain with the supplier's value chain. You think of every organization has a value chain, so it's an attribute of every organization, and this SCM to ERP functionality is really designed at spanning the supplier value chain to the company value chain. Conversely, the CRM functionality is focused on interrelating the company value chain with the buyer value chain, basically the customer value chain. All right, so this is if we think of these things in terms of the value chain, ERP implements the internal value chains. SCM manages the relationship between the supplier value chain and the internal value chains, and CRM is focused on the relationship between internal value chains and the customer value chains. So this is just a kind of a pictorial view of what systems, of kind of what the world looked like before ERP systems, and then kind of what ERP systems, kind of what the post ERP implementation looks like. So kind of in our legacy world up here, we'll see things like individual point systems. All right, so sales, logistics, financial, human resources, project management. All right, each are independently run. Each one are basically there's really their own data domain. So the data that's in project management systems is not necessarily related to any of the data that's in the logistics application, though the reality is some things can be actually connected. So the idea, if we look at an ERP system, kind of the model of what an ERP system does is it brings all of these into one common central repository, all right, and coordinates, on an end-to-end basis. So the idea of, rather than having these disparate systems that, that kind of do their own thing and then, exchange information on some, on an as needed or ad hoc basis between application to application, everything is integrated, right, which can provide tremendous advantages. The challenge is, though, getting an integration to work correctly can be very daunting. Trying to coordinate all of these different activities and all of this data on an end-to-end basis across an entire organization has historically been pretty challenging for organizations to pull off. So one of the things you'll hear a lot of times in the world is around kind of the challenges with ERP systems and how the difficulties organizations have had historically with the implementation of ERP systems. I mean, and there's a number of reasons for that. Part of it is, when you think of trying to coordinate all these different types of activities on an end-to-end basis and being able um, to, get all of these things to work together correctly can be very challenging. And then in addition, all of these things when you integrate them together, you're actually creating interdependencies between a lot of these different pieces. So what will happen is you need to make sure that all the pieces are designed to work together and are configured to work together properly. Because basically, the weakest link is, any one of these areas could potentially be the weakest link, depending if it's not configured to work properly with all of the other ones. So as we look at a model here, we talk around a kind of as we would say, our order to cash model. All right, as we would say here, start with sales, sourcing, production, delivery, invoice. You know, these actually broke down to, these are actually performed by different pieces of the organization. So when we talk about, this idea of an end-to-end process, it's really the coordination of different groups in the organization. All right, so procurement is a different group. It can be a different group than the organization that's responsible for calculating pricing, or the organization that's performing manufacturing, or the organization is coordinating logistics. All right, so each one of these, even though these things are end-to-end processes, as we go from sales to invoice, the actual work is actually done by different groups. All right, and the idea is that through the implementation of an ERP system, there is only one application that all of these groups need to work with. So everything in the organization can be performed inside of the ERP system. It's this idea of business process integration. So all of the key word you'll hear a lot of times, is particularly with ERP and ERP implementations, is this idea of integration. That all these pieces are designed to work together and work and will coordinate as part of its activities. Um, this is actually a big, is just a huge feature, quite frankly. A lot of times in discussions with organizations about what are the advantages of going to an ERP model, quite frankly, the integration is really cited as a significant advantage. And integration is something that should not be taken for granted. A lot of organizations have tried to, you know, said okay they would forego kind of the creation of an ERP model and then attempt to link all of these different applications, these disparate applications they would link them together and kind of integrate them together themselves. However, that actually becomes a lot more challenging in execution. So one of the as difficult as it is to achieve, integration is is actually does provide a significant advantage, and particularly around process and process management, process execution, and the efficiency of an organization. So there's one of the things in particular with ERP, so ERP systems were originally started in the mid '90s, and there was quite a bit of you know at various points, they were kind of a um, controversial item in the business world, primarily because the cost. I mean, so um, at one level, there was kind of a misunderstanding about what an ERP system is all about. So, if you look at it simply from a technological perspective, the idea would be, okay, we've already bought a system, so how tough could it be to install? The answer is it's actually very difficult, because a lot of what ends up happening is the process design, the business reengineering work that all has to be done in order to realign how an organization operates with the capabilities of the system. All right, so there's a big debate which actually continues to this day of okay, should an organization align itself around the capabilities of a system, or should a system be deployed uh, to meet the needs of the organization. So there's kind of a, this conversation goes back and forth, and so of the answer I think really lies in there's probably a significant percentage of an organization's business which can be standardized. It could be using an industry best practice. So the idea of an 80%, say 80, a off the shelf system can provide 80% of your capability. All right. The remaining 20% is really the value is really the value added stuff. The things that really kind of focus on giving an organization a competitive advantage, or what it does in terms of its business, or unique attributes for a particular company. All right. So the idea of an ERP system could give you 20%, and then the question of how do you close that an 80%, and then how do you close that 20% gap? All right. So some of the different, so the evolutions as we've seen, there's kind of the first generations in the 90s, really focused on kind of core business processes. So order execution, distribution, general ledger, accounting, materials planning is really the kind of the key things organizations were looking to implement. As things as companies had kind of moved down the implementation path and had really kind of established this foundation of this first generation ERP, then you saw kind of a next generation. So this idea of much more around kind of coordination and focus on logistics. So things like scheduling and forecasting, capacity planning. The capabilities that the initial systems provide gave organizations the ability to kind of build upon that foundation and extend it to what they call extended ERP. So we saw that probably starting in about 2000. Where we're at now is, these ERP systems are actually have really um, evolved and have added a lot more capability, and particularly, the kind of end-to-end interrelationship between ERP and CRM and SCM systems. In addition, blending functionality like knowledge management, um, portal capabilities, kind of adapting to be more of a web-enabled or web-integrated um, functionality. Right? So, but nevertheless, some very significant, um, these are very significant organizational, uh, demands on the organization. So, things like re-engineering the process rework, um, customization, which is actually another big controversial area. The idea of how much, the idea of an 80-20 rule of of how do you achieve that 20%, and how much is it done through customization, how much of this is done through um, integration with other tools, how much of it is done through modifying business processes. Um, Consulting fees were actually very, very significant. So a lot of, bringing in a consulting organization with a team of consultants, of people billing out in the vicinity of 200 to $400 an hour. Uh, you can burn through a lot of capital very quickly. Um, the software costs are actually a lot of times the software cost, the ratio of, one of the measurements on ERP systems is the ratio of software cost to implementation cost. So, a good project, could be measured something in the range of, say, like a 4-to-1 or 5-to-1. So it would be, cost of the software, 5 times that cost would be your implementation cost. Um, However, a lot of organizations in that ratio, 20 and up to 1 ratio. So pretty significant stuff. And in addition, this idea of testing and training, um, very important to be able to make sure that these processes or testing processes, especially because the discipline required to do things on an end-to-end basis, you're not focused on one particular function, but you're also focused on the downstream implications of that, of how things flow on an end-to-end basis. So, it's a lot of discipline, a lot of process, a lot of work that has to be done um, in these ERP systems, and what that translates to is a lot of cost. So we're talking $100 million, $100 million implementation projects were pretty reasonably common out there. So it was not but and of which the software would be something of the vicinity of maybe 5 to 10 million of $100 million project. Um, just some numbers, throw some numbers here. So this is the idea. So this is about a couple years back, but it's probably not too far off. The top software companies, obviously Microsoft, which is they own the desktop, or they owned a significant percentage of overall desktop, was the largest. Um, Oracle, which really is focused on um, Oracle databases, basically large scale databases. We'll be talking about databases a little bit later in the term. Um, IBM, which is has had historically a pretty significant and maintains a pretty significant footprint in corporations, and then finally SAP, which is an ERP system. So ERP right now, SAP, the approximate number from a couple years back, about 25%. I think they've held that reasonably well. Um, Oracle, which is actually, in addition to being a database provider, has moved into the ERP space. They've actually have bought large numbers of smaller um, software companies, and have tried to develop solutions that and integrate all these things together. They're not quite as integrated as SAP. Um, and then some of the other ones, Infor, which I think is a software as a service platform. Microsoft is actually had moved into that particular space, so they had done a fair amount of stuff in there. They've actually uh, been doing a fair amount of work within a cloud-based software as a service. And you'll see some of these other software platforms out there. Kronos, which does time entry systems, and some of these other ones that are out here. But you also see a 37%. So actually, once you get beyond the first three or four organizations, the whole ERP market is can be pretty fragmented as well. So an SCM system. So here's, as we said, what we're looking to do with an SCM system is planning, sourcing. So that if you look at the steps on an end-to-end basis, this idea of, the first thing that needs to be done for any sort of manufacturing is the planning. What do you want to make? How do you want to make it? All right. The next step, once you figure out what you want to make, is to determine what are your materials. How are you going to source those materials? Establishing the relationship with the suppliers, with who are your raw material, who are your key suppliers in your supply chain. All right. Third step is manufacturing. All right. So the idea is SCM is really focused on these two areas up here. So this idea of the planning phase and the sourcing phase, and the relationships therein. Manufacturing, the information, the work that gets done in the planning phase actually comes into play in the actual manufacturing. What do you make? Production schedules. This actually is also implemented within ERP systems as well. So there's a plan to build process, which is really around manufacturing, which is implemented inside of ERP. So between with these broad sets of processes, we'll see in kind of a coordination integration between an SCM system and an ERP system. All right, and as we move further downstream, delivery, which is actually part of the order to cash execution process, and the returns. So SCM actually has capabilities that there's an overlap, and we'll also see with CRM as well. There's actually a bit of an overlap between ERP systems and SCM systems. And a lot of organizations have chosen, rather than implement SCM, is to just simply, leverage what the functionality is that's inside the ERP system in lieu of doing a full SCM system. Because once again, these things can be very complicated and very challenging to plan and to implement and to operate. The idea is, the organizations that make these types of investments are really focused on trying to optimize their, large manufacturing, you're coordinating, multiple, large numbers of activities with large volumes of resources, with large volumes of, different planning steps. All right, and that's the basis upon which you justify the implementation of an FCM system. So as we kind of talk about this, and this is, we say it's true about a supply chain, it's true of anything, but, particularly supply chain is only as good as its weakest link. So, one of the big areas, one of the big challenges to get within SCM is to make sure that, you've got end-to-end execution, coordination activity, and what will happen is if you get bad information or do bad planning in a supply chain, what will happen is you'll end up either with um, large amounts of stockpiled inventory or idle production equipment if you don't get the material if you don't have materials to build with. All right, so the ongoing this end-to-end monitoring and optimizing of the supply chain is really one of the key parts. So this is, there are whole organizations inside of companies. For example, right now Campbell Soup has a very significantly large supply chain organization, which is really focused on all of their upstream activities. Because if you think about, you go to the store, you buy a can of soup, but if you look at the can of soup and kind of think about, what it takes to actually make a can of soup in terms of the raw materials, which are, the ingredients. If you look at the ingredients on there, bring all those ingredients into one location, the actual creation of the product, the packaging of the product, the labeling of the product, um, the transportation, distribution to various locations. That is all part and parcel of the supply chain. So that is also part and parcel. That's what the supply chain systems, that's what the SAM system is uh, designed to implement. So some of the key metrics we're looking at, there's a couple measurements that are very important to supply chains. So things like back order, are we able to meet customer demand, or things being jammed up? Inventory cycle time. What's the efficiency of our inventory? What's our inventory turns? Do we have material building up, or are we running short of material? Customer order cycle time. The idea of there's a term that gets used is what we call perfect order. So the idea of does a perfect, how long does it take to execute a customer order cycle? All right, are there delays, or are we getting, what percentage of our orders are perfect orders versus what percentages of them require, delays, and how long are those delays? And then finally, inventory turnover. What is the amount of inventory? What is our, you know, because that represents, for actually, the inventory represents a very significant cost to an organization. All right, so the idea is you want to minimize it. You want to keep enough of it to not, so you don't run out, but you don't want to have so much of it that you're tying up capital, um, sitting on a shelf waiting for it to move. Right? So this is all the stuff that's involved with an SCM within an SCM application, and what it helps to optimize. All right. So as we talk around this kind of a coordination, so this idea of the coordination within a supply chain, it's a coordination of procurement, which is the purchasing of the materials, goods, services that are required. There's the materials management. What is the actual you know handling of physical materials as it goes through. So the idea of uh, you know this is where we have our inventory. This is where we maintain and manage our inventories, both of all materials, be they raw materials, be they finished goods, be they spare parts, or whatever is needed. And then logistics. Logistics is that part of the supply chain that handles the coordination for shipping, for distribution, for kind of getting things to where they need to be at the end. So it's really a coordination of three broad areas of processes. All right, so procurement, procurement, materials management, and logistics are all coordinated together. And SCM systems will have that functionality and will work with um, ERP systems. Will be integrated with ERP systems to kind of coordinate this and handle it on an end-to-end basis. So some of the technologies, there's a number of new and disruptive technologies that are out there. So some of the things that we've seen out there, that are potentially impactful for supply chain or SCM, can be implemented in coordination with SCM systems. So 3D printing, the idea of it's a manufacturing process that enables for the creation of uh, basically of small or very focused individual uh, objects using a different material techniques. So 3D printing is we're still relatively early in the cycle, though we've actually have seen some interesting breakthroughs in a couple different areas. It's not a universal, but there's actually been some organizations that have built a car using a 3D printer. So this idea of what we call additive manufacturing. You can create customization, very customized products very quickly with small production batches. So so you're able to be very flexible, very adaptable 3D printing, and that ties into supply chain. RFID, radio frequency identification, uh, which is an electronic tag you put on material, so as you can track it as it moves through your organization and coordinate activities. Material movements, in warehouses, in large warehouses. If you can imagine, like the size of a warehouse, like for example with Amazon, the amount of material that is out there and finding that material and moving it around and getting it to the right place at the right time is very challenging. So RFID has been a technology. It was very big a couple years ago, but is still very much on the planning horizon as a tool. For example, Walmart um, was a very big early advocate of it, and quite frankly, within their supply chain, which is really what they do, they put a huge emphasis on. Drones are, we've seen a lot of discussion around drones. This idea of using drones for material delivery, the ability to have an unmanned delivery instead of handling stuff um, through I guess road traffic or truck or rail. The ability to use a drone to deliver materials is something is the coordination of that into an SCM, into a logistics process is something a lot of organizations have been thinking about looking at. We talked a bit about organizations like Amazon, kind of what Amazon's thinking has been talking about with that, but other organizations are in kind of the same way. This drones tie into an SCM, into the supply chain end-to-end model. And then finally, robotics. So we're seeing more and more discussion of robotics and very customized, very highly capable artificial intelligence types of platforms that are out there. So they'd be able to do sensing of automating warehouse activities. So there's a lot of different supporting activities we see that are tied into this supply chain model. So CRM, just a little more details around the kind of CRM and the CRM um, functionality. The goal of CRM, is really to increase customer loyalty and retention, with the idea of it also having an impact on profitability. So it's focused on capturing communications and interactions between the company and the customer. So the idea of building and using those communications, those interactions to build a relationship. All right. So the CRM, um, the measurement of this is what they call something called RFM. So it's recency, frequency, and monetary value. So the idea of, how, when we say recency, what is the customer activity? How frequently does a customer purchase? Understanding what that behavior is and being able to turn that into some type of predictive model can be very valuable for an organization. Um, the frequency, how frequently, so tied into what is most recent and what is the frequency. And then finally, what is the monetary value? How much is this customer worth to us? How much does this customer buy from us? There are valued customers, and then conversely, there are um, you know not necessarily high valued customers. So organizations really want to be able to put the resources in the right place. So you want to be able to put resources, put focus on your high valued customers, and not necessarily as much emphasis on lower value customers. The key functions of what CRM does, so the idea is it does reporting, customer identification, and what happened. So these are kind of the key questions we see, and analysis, what happens, looking at customer segments, uh, you know, not only gathering information and metrics, but also trying to provide insight into what happened. All right, so why did sales not meet? Why was production so low? Who are the customers? These are all critical questions that companies um, need to know, and it's really the functionality of a CRM system is designed to provide the information to answer those questions. And then finally, which is the goal of you know a lot of things in modern business. The idea of being trying to predict the future. What past behavior is not necessarily indicative of future you of future activities. However, the ability to make important, informed decisions regarding, you know, what we think the customer will do, and then aiming and then shaping our activities around that is very important. So, who are the best, what is happening in terms of, what can we predict what customers are at risk? Can we predict what products our customers will buy? Who are the best customers to reach out to in terms of marketing? So these are all very important activity. These are all very important functions which are tied into what a CRM system is supposed to do. So this is a kind of a high level diagrammatic view of a CRM system. So we've got sales support here, sales management, contact management. This is what your sales. This is really what your sales force, your sales people are involved with. With um, marketing systems in terms of list generator, campaign management, upselling. These are all activities that maybe your salespeople in the field are very much engaged with. Your customer service, though, would be more of a kind of a centralized function, or in a lot of cases, as organizations have moved away from necessarily having a large centralized system, this idea of providing functionality of a web-based, or the idea of call scripting, targeting particular activities to kind of guide customer service folks through a scripted communication with the customer. Right. So this is all the front end stuff that's part of a CRM system. On the back end, the big things we have here, you know, the analytics, gathering the information that are coming from all of these different areas, gathering them into a central data repository, and then being able to have tools, collaborative CRM systems, data mining, data warehousing, reporting, analytics. Um, you know, this is where things like big data would come into play, being able to take large chunks of this information driven at a very detailed level, putting it into a data warehouse, and then being able to analyze it. All right. So this is all part of what the capabilities that a modern CRM system has. The direction that we're seeing, especially with, you know, early on CRM systems were very much focused on just, kind of getting information, kind of the creation of kind of the core functionality with establishing communications and gathering information. the emphasis has been more recently is on taking that information and turning it into what we call analytical CRM. So we got the ability to identify patterns, in sales and customers' behaviors. Um, the idea is this is built upon an operational. So the expectation is you have an operational CRM systems that are already in place, and then the analysis is done on those systems or on the data that's provided from the operational side. So we look at this uplifting model, customer segmentation, um, website personalization, which are all what we're seeing is more and more, and particularly the ability, and you see some like examples of this stuff is, um, well, good examples you see with this is within like Amazon.com, where you will, when you log onto a site, it has gathered information around your interaction, your web interactions, your previous purchases, and can provide information, for example, to basically to direct um, customers to go to areas that of things they might be interested in buying based upon their previous activities, or the idea of you know focusing particular identifying information into particular segments of of where marketing efforts can be concentrated, or personalization. So the idea, like for example, if you go on Amazon, where when you log onto the site, you'll see lists of products of saying people who bought the stuff you're looking at also bought this other stuff. This might perhaps be of interest to you. So this idea is this analytical CRM is really this. It relies very heavily on business intelligence and data warehousing tools to kind of pull this information out. And the ability to work with, you know, the advantages these things have now is that they can work with larger and larger and larger sets of data and be able to do more efficient analysis of that information. And finally, this is just a kind of an example. This is kind of what from a Gartner group researches. Who are the major players? So this is what they call a magic quadrant. All right, so this is kind of breaks all the different players in a particular segment, market, or industry, and kind of breaks them down to what their relative strengths and where they kind of fit uh, in comparison to each other. So the idea is their magic quadrant is broken into four sections. Two dimensions: the ability to execute measured against their completeness of vision, and then categories of challengers, leaders, niche players, and visionaries. Leaders, basically the strongest, the largest, most functional organizations out there, are up in this upper right quadrant. So some of the systems you'll see, um, Salesforce.com, which has really come into its own over the past um, 10 years or so as a major force in the CRM market. And we'll be talking to them a little bit more about them a little bit more downstream. But they are a cloud. Basically, they were an innovator using cloud technology versus an internal deployment for their systems. Some of the other ones you'll see from some names: Oracle, Siebel. So Siebel was actually the original CRM system. It was actually created by a gentleman by the name of Siebel, who was a former Oracle employee who left, created the kind of the concept of the CRM, and then ultimately the product was ended up there. The company ended up being acquired back by Oracle again. But Oracle also has another CRM product, is Oracle Service Cloud. So you got a couple different players, but you see some familiar names. Our SAP once again, Microsoft are all players in this, and some more, a little less known players. Sugar CRM, which is actually an open source, CRM system, and some of these other ones here. And this gives you kind of a breakdown of the, the relative sizing of kind of who's doing well, and so Salesforce.com, Microsoft CRM, pretty strong. SAP is there. And some of these other ones as we go, as we move down the chain. And that is it for chapter 8.